As the Orioles offense was struggling in the second half and dealing with plenty of injuries, this team brought in some bench guys, some fill-in guys like Austin Slater and Emmanuel Rivera and others. And a lot of them, pretty much all of them, filled some kind of role on this Orioles team. But the question is, were they short-term fixes or long-term pieces? We'll try to answer that question coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Friday, October 18th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we are going to review the seasons of four players who joined the Orioles at the All-Star break or later this season. Four hitters who were certainly just here for the stretch run, were never at any point true every single day starters on this team, and by the end of the year didn't have too much of a role, but all played a significant role when the Orioles offense was struggling and was very injured. Those guys are Austin Slater, Eloy Jimenez, Emmanuel Rivera, and Livan Soto. We'll talk about all four of their times this year with the Orioles and whether or not the O's would consider bringing any of them back for 2025. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by Prize Picks. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to win $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup. That's at Prize Picks. Run your game. So again, we're going to be breaking down the seasons of these four Orioles. And this is still part of our 2024 Orioles season review series where we go through pretty much every player on the 40-man roster. They each will usually get an episode, but I thought these guys all played a role, right? Two of these four guys were on the postseason roster. All four of them did something for the O's in September, but none of them were here before the trade deadline. And quite frankly, there's at least a chance that none of them are back next year. So I figured instead of giving each of these guys what could be a pretty short episode, let's combine all four into one. And we will start with Austin Slater. Remember, with these season review episodes, we talk about what went right and what went wrong, and then we talk about their outlook heading into 2025. For these guys specifically, it will be what went right, what went wrong, and would you bring him back? So let's start with Austin Slater, who I would say out of these four probably played the biggest role for the longest time. You could argue it was maybe Emmanuel Rivera, but I would say it was Austin Slater. Now, the Orioles, who had traded Austin Hayes at the deadline to the Phillies for Seranthony Dominguez, were still looking to get a little bit more right-handed, and they went and got Austin Slater, a guy who had a good career with the Giants, was DFA'd by them, was picked up with the Reds, wasn't doing well over there. The Orioles wanted somebody who could hit some lefties. He had done that in his career. He could play all three outfield positions. He seemed like a good fourth or fifth outfielder fit. And the O's basically gave up nothing. They gave up cash to the Reds to get both him and Livan Soto, who we will talk about later. But what went right for Austin Slater? Well, at least for a stretch, he was really productive against lefties, which is something the Orioles needed because when all of those injuries hit, it's something we talked about. They were all right-handed hitters. Jorge Mateo, Ramon Arias, Jordan Westburg, and Ryan Mountcastle, all right-handed hitters who all hit very well against lefties. The Orioles were just missing that in their lineup, and Slater provided a little bit of it. He had a 114 overall WRC plus with the Orioles against left-handed pitching, 707 OPS, but he did walk a good amount, and an 87 WRC plus against right-handed pitching in that stretch. Now, he wasn't as productive probably overall as the Orioles wanted him to be, and he was actually having a bad season against lefties, but that was before he joined the O's. But overall in his career, he'd been a great hitter against left-handers, and really, he kind of gave a big boost to this Oriole lineup in the month of August. He was acquired right before the trade deadline, right at the end of July. And in August with the O's, Slater hit 278, had a 783 OPS. That's a 130 WRC plus. Now, it was only in 41 plate appearances. He was basically exclusively either starting against lefties, and then he'd get pinch hit for when a righty came in, or when he didn't start a game, if there was a spot late in the game against a tough lefty, he would maybe pinch hit for a Cedric Mullins, a Jackson Holliday, a Ryan O'Hearn, a whomever late in a game. But there was a point there in August, like late August, where Orioles fans were kind of pulling for Slater to play even more. And it did happen a little bit in August and September where he started against some righties as well. Now, the other thing that went well was you could trust him in all three outfield spots. That was one of the biggest reasons why the O's brought him in. They felt like, okay, even if this guy ends up being mostly a pinch hitter, we can put him in the field in all three spots. He ended up playing 41 innings for the Orioles in right field, 10 innings in center field, and 103 innings in left field, and graded out well in all three of those spots defensively. And heck, he got a hit in the playoffs. There were some guys who didn't do that, but he came off the bench when Colton Cowser got injured in game 2 and ended up getting a hit in the 8th inning of that game against the Royals, and really just allowed this O's team, as I mentioned, to be more right-handed, be good in the outfield when he was out there. He was just a nice complementary fit to this roster. Now, what went wrong for Austin Slater? Well, he had a bad September. It was a great August. It was a terrible September. 38 plate appearances in September, once again, was basically just playing against lefties. He hit just .212 with a 72 WRC plus. And really the worst part was in September, you talk about him just kind of playing against lefties. He finished the season 1 for 9 with a single against left-handers. He kind of stopped not facing them because the O's were giving him chances, but stopped producing at all against lefties down the stretch. There was an overall 1 for 16 stretch he had in mid-September, which kind of sent him towards the outskirts of playing time for the Orioles. And by the time we got to the postseason, he was no longer a go-to part of the Orioles lineup against lefties. Now, some of that was Slater struggling in September. More of it was the fact that Arias, Westberg, and Mountcastle had all returned, all guys who you're definitely going to play against left-handers in there. But Slater lost his role, and you really saw it in game 1 of the wild card series when the Orioles, and I talked about this when I previewed that wild card series with the really good lefty in Cole Reagans on the hill for the Royals in game 1. I talked about how there were multiple scenarios for the O's to go with in their lineup. And the one I went with was actually starting Austin Slater in that game. And instead, Brandon Hyde chose to start James McCann behind the plate and DH Adley Rutschman to get another right-hander in there. And that kind of tells you how they thought about Slater by the end of the year, that yes, McCann was probably the better defensive option catching and had caught Corbin Burns a lot. So that was certainly a factor. But they didn't think the difference between Slater and McCann offensively against a lefty was big enough to still put Slater into the game there. And that was kind of telling for his end of the season. So the question then is, okay, would you bring him back? And I would say yes, if it's cheap. Now, if someone's willing to give Slater $10 or more million, if someone's willing to give Slater for some reason a multi-year deal, not looking at this year, but looking at his past, right? Like this year with the Orioles, Austin Slater, he was not good with the Giants in about 100 plate appearances. They let him go. He signed with the Reds, 21 plate appearances. He got like 1 hit. He wasn't good. Then he came to the Orioles and he was at least league average with the bat. 79 plate appearances over 33 games. He hit 246, 342 on base, 333 slug. It's a 102 WRC plus. He had a homer. He drove in 6. He stole a base. He walked a good amount. That was what he did. He was a league average hitter and a good defender. That's a player who, again, small sample size, right? Less than 100 plate appearances, but a guy you want on your team as a 4th outfielder. I think, and I've made this known, the Orioles are going to be looking for some sort of right-handed hitting veteran outfielder this year. I truly think that if the Orioles were to sign, and I think they will, sign a free agent hitter, I think the only kind of guy it would be a right-handed hitting outfielder, and that is what Slater is. Plus, he can play all 3 outfield positions well, and he knows Baltimore a little bit. He has been here for a bit. So I would love the Orioles to reach a little higher than Slater, especially if they can't re-sign Anthony Santander. Now, if they re-sign Santander, I would honestly just bring back Slater. But if you can't get Santander back, you got to get another guy in the outfield with a higher ceiling. I'd be shooting for more of a Tyler O'Neill type who had a huge year in Boston as right-handed hitting outfielder. But again, Slater could still be some sort of fallback option. Good defender, good runner, draws a lot of walks, has a history of good exit velocity numbers, squares up the ball really well. And he's one of the best players in baseball in not chasing outside of the strike zone, which I know some Orioles fans were very upset with other O's hitters for doing that a lot down the stretch, something Slater historically and this year just does not do, and that leads to a lot of walks for him. Could all combine for him to potentially be back in an Orioles uniform. Now let's move to Eloy Jimenez. Eloy Jimenez also acquired at the trade deadline by the Orioles from the White Sox. Jimenez, who had just dealt with so many injuries, just basically couldn't play the field anymore, was fully a DH, wasn't really producing in Chicago. And the Orioles sent Trey McGuff over there, a left-handed pitcher who was having a good year in AAA, but wasn't like a big-time prospect. And in return, they got a couple of months of Eloy Jimenez. What went right for Jimenez? Well, the Orioles upped his launch angle, and that was the big thing for him. Jimenez, always a guy who hits the ball hard, and that is kind of the first thing you're looking at as a hitter. 49% hard hit rate, 92 mile per hour average exit velocity. Those are both in the 90th percentile of all major league hitters this year in terms of how hard he's hitting the ball. And that's led to success in the past. He had 31 home runs as a rookie with the White Sox back in 2019. He's flashed a good amount of power at times, but he just started to, and some of it was because of the injuries, but he just started to beat the ball into the ground. A 2.7 degree average launch angle for Eloy Jimenez in a White Sox uniform this year. That is abysmal. That's basically like, if he puts the ball in play, you could basically guarantee it's going to be a ground ball. And listen, sometimes hard hit ground balls sneak into left field for a base hit. But if you hit the ball on the ground, you're not hitting home runs and you're rarely even getting extra base hits. It really limits what you can do offensively if you're mostly hitting the ball on the ground. And the Orioles upped that level. They got it to an 8.4 degree average launch angle with the Orioles. And he ended up with the O's getting, not a crazy amount of playing time, but he had 100 plate appearances. But here's the thing. He was good early. And that was the other thing. It initially worked. In 73 plate appearances in August, he hit 296 with a 108 WRC plus for the O's. He wasn't as productive overall as Austin Slater. He was still in too many ground balls, but more fly balls. He hit like his first home run since May. He was putting the ball in play, was hitting almost 300. He was a helpful, he was DHing against lefties. And there was one point there in August where, kind of similar to Slater, Jimenez, because the Orioles were just so injured, were struggling so much offensively, that Jimenez also got in there against righties. He would DH against some right-handed pitchers as well, because he was just hitting and nobody else on the O's was. Same with Slater. They were like, these aren't our best players, but Jimenez and Slater are hitting, these other guys aren't. So let's just put them in the lineup. And it was working for a while. And that is all well and good. He kept hitting the fastball. He was hitting 367 with just an 11% whiff rate against fastballs in August. Basically means you could not get a fastball by Eloy Jimenez. Now, what went wrong? Well, that launch angle change, which was good, didn't turn into sustained production for Jimenez. After a really good August, he went 1 for 24 in the month of September. He went from swing and missing 11% of the time to 28% of the time against fastballs, which is a pitch he has always crushed. He did not start a game after September 17th. He did not appear in a game after September 21st. In fact, he was optioned to AAA in the final week of the season once the Orioles got Arias and Westberg and Mountcastle back. He had enough service time where he didn't have to accept that option, but he basically knew, hey, it's the last week of the season. Nobody else is going to pick me up. Maybe the O's would still consider me for the playoff roster. I'm just going to accept going down to AAA because he had options left. The Orioles basically got him off the team because, again, you can't go 1 for 24 when the rest of the team is struggling too. And obviously the other part that went wrong is he just still wasn't healthy. There was never even a thought that he could play any position in the field. He was stuck to being a DH and a pinch hitter, which limits the flexibility of your roster when you're carrying a guy like that who's not an everyday player. And that at the end was kind of his downfall with the O's, but very similar to Slater, who I think definitely overall produced more than Eloy Jimenez did. It was such a low cost pickup for 2 months. And you're not tied to him beyond this year. Like, Slater is a free agent right now, so the Orioles would have to go to bring him back. For Eloy Jimenez, that brings us to the, would you bring him back? Now, he's going to be a free agent. He has multiple club options on his contract. He has a team option for $16 million for 2025, which means the Orioles get to decide either A, we pay Eloy Jimenez $16 million and he returns to the Orioles next year, or B, we decline the option and he just becomes a free agent. They are not paying Eloy Jimenez $16 million to be on this team next year. Nobody is. So they're going to decline that option and he's going to become a free agent. The question is not about the option. We know what's happening there. The question is, would the Orioles then reach back out to him and try to work out a cheaper deal to bring him back? I think it's possible because the Orioles obviously saw something there with the hard hit abilities, the fact that they were able to get him to raise the launch angle, hopefully a healthy offseason, get him to a point where, yeah, you don't want to play him in the outfield, but he could at least be athletic enough to run and think about playing the field if he needed to, which would make him more valuable. And if the O's could get him back for like 1 year, $4 or $5 million, maybe they would do it to be a DH option. But when you just look at, Kobe Mayo coming into the fold, and we'll see if Ryan Mountcastle's still on this team, but there's not as much of a spot on this roster for a guy like Eloy Jimenez, especially if you bring Anthony Santander back. So what I think will happen is the Orioles may have conversations with him. What I think he'll do is he'll sign with a bad team, not the White Sox, a different bad team, but he'll sign with a bad team like the Athletics or maybe the Nationals, who need some guys who hit the ball hard, or somebody like that. He'll sign with on a 1 year, $8, $9, $10 million deal, a prove it deal, a team that he knows, hey, maybe I won't play every day, but I'll play most days. I'll get 500 plate appearances, and hopefully I can rebuild my value, get healthy, show I'm healthy, become a free agent again next winter, and then try to cash in on a little bit better of a contract if I continue to show that I can hit. But it was fun for a bit to get Eloy Jimenez, at least to save him from the White Sox. That was at least a cool thing with this. So those were two of the guys that the Orioles brought in. Next up, we're going to get to the two others, and Emmanuel Rivera and Livan Soto, talking about their short 2024 campaigns with the Orioles. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by HIMSHims. Your sex life is important, but your schedule is busy. You don't have time to go to a doctor's office to get treated for ED. Well, through HIMSHims, you can get personalized ED treatment without stepping foot outside your door. HIMSHims is changing men's healthcare by providing you with access to affordable sexual health treatments from the comfort of your couch. The process is 100% online, so there's no need for an uncomfortable visit to the doctor. And no insurance is needed. One low price covers everything from treatments to ongoing care. And you can start your free online visit today at HIMS.com/lockedon. That's HIMS.com/lockedon for your personalized ED treatment options. Again, that is HIMS.com/lockedon. The products mentioned are chewable compounded products which are not approved by or verified for safety or effectiveness by the FDA. Prescriptions require an online consultation with a healthcare provider who will determine if appropriate restrictions apply. See website for details and important safety information. Subscription required. Price varies based on product and subscription plan. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by the DK Law Group. When you did a law firm, do you want the legal runaround, or would you rather have a no-nonsense approach? Well, you get the latter with the DK Law Group, a Maryland-based law firm who is redefining the legal process with their modern approach. The DK Law Group specializes in real estate law, estate planning, business law, and family law. They're tech savvy, they treat their clients like family, and they focus on keeping your legal solutions simple, because the DK Law Group knows that speed is key. By leveraging technology, the DK Law Group streamlines the process to serve you better and faster. So contact the DK Law Group today at dklawmd.com. And Locked On Orioles listeners can call today to schedule a free 30-minute consultation when you mention the tagline, Empowering Legacies. So we move on talking about some of the reinforcements the Orioles brought in near the end of the season to help out a struggling and very injured lineup. And next up is Emmanuel Rivera. First of all, what went right with Rivera? Well, a lot of things. He just kept hitting. Rivera was claimed off waivers on August 21st from the Marlins, activated to the roster on August 22nd. And then he just kind of went off. He wasn't playing every day. He was mostly playing against lefties at the beginning, but he finished in 27 games, 73 plate appearances with the Orioles. Rivera hit .313 with a .370 on base and a .578 slugging, 4 homers, 14 RBIs. That is good for a 166 WRC plus in his 73 plate appearances with the Birds. If you look at that timeline from August 22nd until the end of the season, and you bump it down to players with 70 or more plate appearances in that stretch. So it does bring in some guys like Rivera who are not everyday players. Emmanuel Rivera had the 15th best WRC plus in all of Major League Baseball in that stretch from August 22nd to the end of the season. He was one of the best hitters in the league, and he led the Orioles by a wide margin in that span as well. His barrel rate, his hard hit rate, his average exit velocity all shot up with the O's. Those are things that had been good at times, like in years past with the Arizona Diamondbacks, but he was struggling mightily at the plate with the Marlins. When he came over, he had a 60 WRC plus in about 100 games with Miami. Like, he was just flat out terrible, and he turned into one of the best hitters in the Orioles lineup when he was in there after coming to Baltimore. This O's team still can find things about guys that work. He was one of the best players in Seager, which is a newer metric that is named after Corey Seager, that basically sees which hitters take the balls and swing at the good strikes. Not just swing at the strikes, but swing at the strikes in the middle of the zone and do damage against them. Rivera was already good at that. He was one of the best at that when he was with the O's as well. And basically, he feasted on hanging breaking balls. If you hung a breaking ball to Emmanuel Rivera, he didn't miss it. Slugging .851 in September against breaking balls. That is absurd what he was doing to breaking pitches. And again, 73 plate appearances. We are not talking about a very large sample size here, but the Orioles desperately needed any kind of production at third base. Once Arias sprained his ankle in Colorado, they had both Jordan Westburg, who was swinging the bat well and was an all-star, and then Ramon Arias, who, when he got injured, was the Orioles' hottest hitter at the time. They were without both of those guys, both right-handers. They needed something. They went to Rivera, and he delivered. I mean, what a waiver claim by Mike Elias and the O's this ended up being. And listen, the O's got healthy again. Arias, Westburg, Mountcastle all returned in that final week. They got Heston Kjerstad back as well. But even with all of that, Emmanuel Rivera still made the Orioles postseason roster, because even though they knew, despite how good he had been, listen, we have better players, you're probably not going to start postseason games. He produced enough to get him. I honestly thought they might have left him off that roster, but they put him on the roster, and he got a postseason pinch hit at bat in game 1 against the Royals. Now, he didn't come through. I think he grounded out in that AB, but the Orioles at least gave him a chance because, listen, they put one of their hottest bats in there to give him a shot there in that game, and he had been swinging it so well. It was kind of amazing to watch. Now, what went wrong for Rivera? Well, the defensive metrics did not like him, which was really weird. He played about 135 innings at third base with the Orioles, so that's a very small sample size. Take it with a grain of salt. But -2 outs above average, -5 defensive runs saved at third base in that short time is pretty striking. He made some really good plays at first base. He played there a little bit with the O's, but he was known as a really good third base defender when he was claimed by the O's. And I don't know how much I want to read into short sample size defensive metrics, but he didn't look amazing over there. And the numbers were like, he was straight out bad to put up that much negative value in that short a time. It's just something to monitor there. As his offense skyrocketed, the defense kind of went in the other direction. But the question is, again, would you bring him back? Now, MLB Trade Rumors estimates that in arbitration, Rivera would make about $1.4 million in 2025. That is very, very cheap for any major league player, especially when your owner is now David Rubenstein. So the money shouldn't really factor in here. The factor is he's out of options, so you can't just send him to AAA. You would have to DFA him. And remember, the Orioles claimed him last time. Somebody else would probably claim him this time. And you also have a very crowded infield. I mean, it feels like you go into next year with Henderson, Westburg, Arias, Mateo, Holiday, all with locked up infield positions. And, you probably have Mountcastle and O'Hearn back at the first base mix as well. And then Kobe Mayo is going to be certainly in that infield mix. That is very, very crowded. I mean, for that amount of money, if he can survive a 40-man crunch this offseason, I would at least keep him around in spring training and see if he can build off of what he did with you offensively last year and try and steal a spot away from Mateo or Arias or Mayo or whomever, but let him compete for a job. But I kind of think, even though the process was good too, again, all those hard hit numbers and everything, all the underlying data got good with the numbers, I still think just what we've seen from Rivera in his career, I mean, 2023 with Arizona, 82 WRC plus, 2022, 95, 2021, 78 with the Royals. Like, he hasn't really been a good hitter, so he could turn things around. Ryan O'Hearn did it, but I think it could be some fool's gold. And with the Orioles having just clear, better options in the infield, because he doesn't have options. If he did and you can send it to AAA, I'd say keep him, but you can't. So you're probably going to have to get rid of him at some point. There's just really nowhere to play him. And at that point, again, just pay him the $1.4 million and put him in spring training. But I wouldn't be surprised if the Orioles non-tender him, which means they basically just don't go to arbitration with him. Instead of, haggling over a number, they just cut him loose and make him a free agent this offseason. It could go either way. If this were the 2021 Orioles, they'd be keeping him around and saying he's starting at third base next year. But this is a different era. Even though a guy gives you a good month, you really have to see if it's going to be worth it to let him fight it out. And maybe it should be. Again, $1.4 million, that's nothing. That is nothing. At least let him compete, but it just doesn't seem like there's really a path for him to get to a big league spot for the O's in 2025. Remember, the whole reason he was here was because of all the injuries. And as soon as those guys got back, he was on the postseason roster, but you would think Kobe Mayo would have that spot that he didn't in the playoffs going into next year. Last guy to get to, Livan Soto. Came over at the trade deadline along with Austin Slater in that very minor move for cash from the Cincinnati Reds. Livan Soto, what went right? Well, he was a wizard at second base. Now, only played 32 innings there. He had one out above average. Like, you're not going to look at a lot of the metrics in 32 innings, but the eye test was he looked awesome at second base. Like, it was fun to watch him field balls, to watch him turn double plays especially. He was a really good second baseman. He also played some short, some third for the Orioles as well, which gives him good versatility as a left-handed bat. And he gave some quality ABs. Like, he only had 16 plate appearances with the Orioles, 3 for 13, a double, 3 walks, 3 strikeouts. Like, that's fine. That's fine at the plate for a guy who hasn't played a lot at the big league level over the past couple of years. Like, Soto was with the Angels for 18 games in 2022, 4 games in 2023, then 13 games total between Cincinnati and Baltimore in 2024 in the big leagues. But he's only 24 years old, right? He's still got a lot of baseball ahead of him, you would think, in his career. Now, what went wrong was he just really didn't play much at all. Like, with all the injuries, that's why he got a spot on the team when he did. And the Orioles went and got him at the trade deadline. But he was on the roster for 34 days in 2 separate stints. He only got into, what was it? What did I say? 13 games? He only got into 13 games as an Oriole? Yeah, no, he only got into 12 games as an Oriole and 13 plate appearances. So, like, even though he is on the roster, the Orioles were very tentative to use him at all, which you get. He was, I mean, not to disparage the guy, but he was the worst player on the roster when he was on it. Like, and I think he knew that, the Orioles knew that, but he served a role as a utility guy who could fill in anywhere in the infield and a little bit in the outfield if you needed him to. Now, would you bring Livan Soto back? I would say yes, and here's why. Not only is he versatile, not only is he 24, but he has options remaining for next year, which means he's not an arbitration. He's still very cheap. As long as he can survive the 40-man roster, which I think he will, you bring him into spring training. And again, I mentioned with Rivera, all those infielders, Henderson, Westberg, Arias, Mateo, Holiday, Mayo. He's probably not going to make the team unless there's an injury. But if he doesn't, he has options. So you can just send him to AAA Norfolk and keep him in your organization as good depth. And again, there's going to be injuries, and Soto could be that first guy you call on to come up to the big leagues. And here's the other thing. Livan Soto was acquired by the Orioles 3 different times last season. That tells me Mike Elias kind of likes this guy. So I would think if they can find a way to keep him around, they will, especially because he has options and he can play good second. He can handle the bat a little bit. Not bad depth to have for you in AAA. But that'll do it for those 4 season reviews. We'll take one more break and come back and just a couple of news and notes to get to while we end the day and the week here on the podcast. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Prize Picks, which is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You can run your game all season long on Prize Picks. And listen, I mentioned it, win 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. It's not a bad deal. It takes like 60 seconds to get your picks in. Football, basketball, hockey, baseball, whatever it is. You put your players in there. You take more, you take less, whatever it is. You get it right. You win some cash. It's very easy to play, very fun to play as well. So download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is at Prize Picks. Run your game. So just to finish things up here on a Friday episode, thank you all for tuning into the show as usual. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to the Locked On Orioles YouTube page. We're close to 8,000 subscribers. Once we get there, we're going to do a fun giveaway on the show, and you do have to be subscribed on YouTube to be entered in the giveaway, to make sure to come over here. Also, wherever you listen, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, we appreciate that so much as well. If you could leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, that really, really helps out the pod and gives you a chance to leave your thoughts about the show. Do it right there in the Apple reviews as well. That really, really helps out. Just did want to mention a couple of Orioles things. Colton Cowser did have successful surgery this week on his fractured left hand. Remember that kind of postseason exit defining play in Game 2 of the Wild Card Series. Bases loaded, 1-2 pitch gets hit on the hand by an Angel Zerpa sinker, except for the fact that he swung at it while it hit him in the hand. So instead of a go-ahead hit by pitch to give the Orioles a 2-1 lead. It was a strikeout for the second out of the inning. That one still hurts, and it was still hurting Colton Cowser because it fractured his left hand. He played like one more inning in the field and then was removed. Austin Slater replaced him in that game. The Orioles always kept saying, like, hey, he's going to be ready for spring training, but there were still questions about whether or not he would need surgery. Well, apparently he did. He got surgery this week, but the O's said it went well, and again, they are still saying he should be full go, good to go when the Orioles get to Sarasota in February. So that is definitely good news for Cowser. I hope it doesn't hurt any of his training development this offseason. We know he needs to work on identifying that changeup. That was the one big issue for Colton Cowser. Hopefully the broken hand doesn't eat into that at all with the offseason work, but it is good to know that he will be a full go, hopefully, when the O's do get to Sarasota after successful surgery this week. The Orioles also released Ronald Guzman from the minor leagues. Guzman kind of an interesting story that the Orioles brought in this year. Former Major League first baseman with the Rangers and the Yankees for a few years, who then converted to a pitcher a couple years back. Orioles signed him to a minor league deal this year because, hey, he's a big lefty who throws in the high 90s. Let's see what he's got. Well, he barely pitched in Aberdeen. He got injured again, and the Orioles have released him. It kind of seems like, from what I've seen, his attempt at converting and being a professional pitcher may be over, and like retirement time is coming soon for Ronald Guzman. But hey, you like the Orioles trying new things, bringing him in, see what could happen. Unfortunately, his body just didn't hold up and didn't work out for him, at least with the O's trying to get back to the big leagues this time as a pitcher. And then I was going to have some thoughts about Guardians-Yankees in the ALCS and just what in the world the Guardians were doing in those first two games. I mean, how are you putting yourself in so many spots where Austin Hedges has to hit in big moments? Like, what are we doing over in Cleveland? But as I'm recording, Cleveland leads the Yankees 3-1 in the eighth. They're 4 outs away from a Game 3 victory to get back in this series. So I will withhold that judgment for now. Maybe we'll talk a little more MLB playoffs next week on the show. But either way, we will be back on Monday getting you any Orioles news and, of course, continuing our Orioles Player 2024 season review series when we're back Monday. Until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.